How dare you speak to me that way? Do you have any idea who I am? Every head in Spago, Beverly Hills turned at once. All eyes landed on the furious blonde woman towering over a table where a young black woman sat in a simple navy dress. Patricia Hartwell's manicured finger pointed accusingly, her voice dripping with entitlement. I will not be insulted by some cheap, classless nobody. Her hand flew through the air with vicious speed. Slap. The sound echoed like a gunshot. Some diners gasped, others pulled out their phones to record. Who is she? Someone whispered. Probably lost or something. Nervous laughter rippled through the gallery, but Celeste Williams didn't flinch. In that instant, Patricia had just made the biggest mistake in her life that would destroy her entire world in the next 60 seconds. If you are enjoying this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, like the video and comment where you are watching from. Your support helps us bring more powerful stories. And trust me, you won't want to miss them.
Did you just put your hands on my wife? My wife!
Now, let's continue. The late afternoon sun filtered through the tall windows of the Bel Air mansion on October 15, 2024, casting golden light across the marble floors of the master bedroom. Celeste Williams stood before her walk-in closet, running her fingers along the fabric of a simple navy blue dress. At 28, she possessed an understated beauty that needed no enhancement. Warm brown skin that seemed to glow from within, expressive dark eyes framed by naturally long lashes, and a gentle smile that had first captured her husband's heart 3 years ago. This one feels right, she murmured to herself, pulling the modest knee-length dress from its hanger. The fabric was quality cotton, well-tailored but unpretentious, exactly the kind of clothing that made her feel most comfortable. From the adjoining bathroom came the sound of running water as Adrian Williams finished his shower. At 35, Adrian commanded attention wherever he went. 6 feet 2 inches of confident presence, with a kind of sharp intelligence in his green eyes that had built an empire worth over $2 billion. His tech company, Nexus Innovations, had revolutionized cloud computing, but right now his mind was focused entirely on the evening ahead. Celeste, darling, are you ready? Adrian's voice carried from the bathroom, warm with the slight Boston accent that emerged when he was relaxed. Our reservation at Spago is at 7:30. Celeste glanced at the digital clock on the nightstand. 6:45 p.m. She slipped into the navy dress, appreciating how the fabric moved naturally with her body. As she fastened the simple silver necklace Adrian had given her for their second anniversary, she caught her reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back at her seemed caught between two worlds, the girl who had grown up in a tiny apartment in Detroit, and the wife of one of America's wealthiest men. Adrian emerged from the bathroom, adjusting his charcoal gray suit jacket. He looked every inch the successful businessman, from his perfectly styled dark hair to his Italian leather shoes. When he saw Celeste, his expression shifted slightly, love mixed with gentle concern. "You look beautiful," he said, crossing to where she stood. His hands found her waist, pulling her close. "You always do." Celeste heard the unspoken, but in his tone. They'd had this conversation before, always gently, always with love, but it lingered between them like morning fog. "I know what you're thinking," she said softly, straightening his tie even though it didn't need adjusting. "You want me to wear the Valentino dress." Adrian's thumb traced along her cheek. "I want you to wear whatever makes you happy. It's just..." He paused, choosing his words carefully. Spago attracts a certain crowd. People judge first and ask questions later. I don't want anyone to treat you poorly because they don't understand who you are. Celeste's heart clenched. This was the eternal struggle of their marriage. Adrian's protective instincts warring with her need to remain true to herself. She understood his concern. In their world of charity galas and business dinners, appearance often mattered more than substance. But the thought of transforming herself into someone unrecognizable felt like betraying the woman he'd fallen in love with. "I'll change," she said quietly, but Adrian caught her hand as she moved toward the closet. "No." His voice was firm but tender. I fell in love with the woman who wore a $15 dress to our first coffee date and made it look like $1 million. Don't change for anyone, not even me. The memory brought a smile to both their faces. That autumn day 3 years ago when they'd met at a small cafe in Westwood seemed like a lifetime ago. Celeste had been working as a literacy coordinator for underprivileged children, barely scraping by on her non-profit salary but rich in purpose. Adrian, taking a rare break from his demanding schedule, had been immediately drawn to her passionate discussion about educational inequality with the barista. "Are you sure?" Celeste asked, searching his face. "I'm sure." Adrian kissed her forehead. "You're perfect exactly as you are." 20 minutes later, they were seated in Adrian's midnight blue Bentley, gliding through the tree-lined streets of Beverly Hills. The autumn evening was warm for October, typical of Southern California's stubborn resistance to seasonal change. Celeste watched the elegant shops and restaurants pass by, each more exclusive than the last. "Nervous?" Adrian asked, noticing her quiet demeanor. "A little," she admitted. "I always feel like I'm wearing a costume in places like this." Adrian reached across the center console to take her hand. "You belong everywhere I belong. Don't let anyone make you feel otherwise." His words were meant to comfort, but Celeste couldn't shake the feeling that tonight would test that belief. As they pulled up to Spago Beverly Hills, with its understated elegance and reputation as a haven for Hollywood's elite, she took a deep breath and prepared to enter a world that still felt foreign despite 3 years of marriage. The valet opened her door with practiced efficiency, and Celeste stepped onto the sidewalk in her comfortable flats and simple dress. Around them, other patrons were arriving in luxury vehicles, the women draped in designer gowns and glittering jewelry that caught the restaurant's warm lighting. Mrs. Williams, the maitre d', greeted them warmly as they entered. "Your usual table is ready." The dining room buzzed with the low murmur of expensive conversations and the gentle clink of fine crystal. Celeste followed Adrian to their table, aware of the subtle glances from other diners. Some looked curious, others dismissive. She'd learned to read these expressions over the years, the way people's eyes would slide over her simple appearance before focusing entirely on Adrian. "Relax," Adrian whispered as they settled into their seats. "You're the most beautiful woman in this room, and more importantly, you're the kindest." Before Celeste could respond, Adrian's phone buzzed urgently. He glanced at the screen and frowned. "It's the Tokyo office," he said apologetically. "The Yamamoto deal. There's been a complication. I need to take this." Celeste nodded understandingly. Even on their date nights, Adrian's responsibilities as CEO sometimes intruded. "Go ahead. I'll be fine. 5 minutes, I promise." Adrian stood, kissing the top of her head before stepping toward the restaurant's quieter bar area to take his call. Left alone, Celeste sipped her water and observed the elegant scene around her. The soft lighting cast everything in a warm glow, and the quiet conversations created an atmosphere of refined intimacy. She was just beginning to relax when she noticed a woman at a nearby table staring at her with undisguised hostility. The woman was perhaps 45, with professionally styled blonde hair and the kind of sharp-featured beauty that suggested extensive cosmetic enhancement. She wore a white designer dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, and her jewelry caught the light with every disapproving gesture she made to her dinner companions. "What do you think you're looking at?" The question formed in Celeste's mind, but she quickly pushed it away. She was being paranoid. The woman was probably looking at something else entirely. But as the minutes passed and Adrian's call stretched longer than expected, Celeste became increasingly aware of the woman's attention. Finally, she saw the blonde woman excuse herself from her table and begin walking directly toward her. Celeste's heart rate quickened. Something in the woman's expression, a mixture of disgust and self-righteous anger, made her stomach tighten with familiar dread. She'd seen that look before, growing up in Detroit, and it never led anywhere good. The woman was now standing beside Celeste's table, her cold blue eyes scanning Celeste from head to toe with obvious disdain. When she finally spoke, Her voice carried the practiced authority of someone accustomed to getting her way. "Excuse me," she said, her tone dripping with false politeness, "but I think there's been some kind of mistake." Celeste looked up at the woman standing beside her table, her heart already beginning to race with an instinct she'd hoped never to feel again. The blonde woman's presence radiated hostility like heat from asphalt on a summer day, and Celeste could smell her expensive perfume mixed with something sharper, the acrid scent of prejudice and entitlement. "I'm sorry," Celeste said softly, her voice steady despite the warning bells clanging in her mind. "What kind of mistake?" The woman's lips curved into a smile that never reached her eyes. She was tall, perhaps 5'8" in her designer heels, with a kind of artificially perfect appearance that spoke of personal trainers, weekly salon appointments, and a surgeon's careful hand. Her white Chanel dress probably cost more than most families spent on groceries in 6 months, and the tennis bracelet on her wrist caught the restaurant's ambient lighting like captured stars. "Well," the woman said, loud enough that nearby tables began to turn their attention toward the conversation, "I couldn't help but notice you sitting here all alone, and I thought perhaps you were lost." Around them, the gentle hum of dinner conversation began to quiet as other patrons sensed drama brewing. Celeste was acutely aware of the eyes turning in their direction, the way conversations paused mid-sentence as people strained to listen. The warmth she'd felt moments earlier was rapidly being replaced by a cold knot of dread in her stomach. "I'm not lost," Celeste replied calmly, though her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her water glass. "I'm having dinner with my husband." The woman's laugh was sharp and brittle, like breaking crystal. "Your husband?" She glanced around theatrically, making sure she had the attention of the surrounding tables. "I don't see anyone with you, dear. And frankly, I'm having trouble understanding how someone like you could afford to eat at a place like Spago." The words hit Celeste like physical blows. "Someone like you." The phrase contained multitudes of assumption and hatred, wrapped in the deceptively polite language of Beverly Hills society. Celeste had encountered this before. The assumption that her skin color automatically disqualified her from certain spaces, certain levels of success, certain types of respect. "My husband stepped away to take a business call," Celeste said, her voice remaining level despite the fury beginning to build in her chest. "He'll be back shortly." "Oh, how convenient," the woman said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "A mysterious husband who's conveniently absent." She leaned closer, lowering her voice to a stage whisper that still carried to nearby tables. "Listen, sweetheart, I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but this establishment has standards. People like you don't just wander in here and sit down at premium tables." Celeste felt heat flood her cheeks. The phrase, "people like you," hung in the air between them like a toxic cloud. Every eye in their section of the restaurant was now focused on their exchange, and Celeste could see the mixture of curiosity, discomfort, and unfortunately, agreement on some of the watching faces. "I have every right to be here," Celeste said, her voice growing firmer. "Just like anyone else." The woman's perfectly manicured eyebrows rose in mock surprise. "Rights? Oh, honey, let me explain something to you about rights." She gestured grandly around the elegant dining room. "This isn't some chain restaurant where anyone with $20 can walk in. This is Spago, Beverly Hills. Do you have any idea what it costs to eat here? Do you know who comes here?" Celeste's hands clenched in her lap. She thought of Adrian's words in the car, "You belong everywhere I belong." But sitting here now, facing this woman's venom while her husband was absent, those words felt fragile as spun glass. "I know exactly where I am," Celeste said quietly. "And I know I have every right to be here." "Rights don't pay for $30 appetizers," the woman snapped, her veneer of politeness finally cracking completely. "And they certainly don't make you belong in places like this. Look at yourself." Her eyes raked over Celeste's simple navy dress with undisguised contempt. "That dress probably came from Target. Those shoes look like something from Payless. You're completely out of your league here." The cruelty in the woman's voice was breathtaking. Celeste felt tears threatening at the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them back furiously. She would not give this woman the satisfaction of seeing her cry. "My clothes don't determine my worth," Celeste said, surprised by the strength in her own voice. "And they certainly don't give you the right to judge me." "Worth?" The woman laughed again, the sound like breaking bones. "Let me tell you about worth, dear. I'm Patricia Hartwell. My husband owns half the commercial real estate in Beverly Hills. We donate more to charity in a year than you probably make in a decade. I know everyone who matters in the city, and I can guarantee you that none of them would appreciate having their evening disrupted by someone who clearly doesn't understand proper social boundaries." Patricia Hartwell. The name meant nothing to Celeste, but the way Patricia pronounced it suggested it should command immediate respect and deference. Around them, Celeste could hear whispered conversations as other diners tried to figure out what was happening. "I'm not disrupting anyone's evening," Celeste said. "I'm simply having dinner." "No," Patricia said, her voice rising slightly. "You're making everyone uncomfortable. Look around you. Do you see anyone else dressed like they're going to the grocery store? Do you see anyone else who looks like they belong here as little as you do?" The words were carefully chosen daggers, each one designed to wound. Celeste felt her confidence crumbling under the assault, felt herself shrinking back into the scared little girl she'd been growing up in Detroit, the one who'd learned early that there were places she wasn't welcome simply because of the color of her skin. "I think you should leave," Patricia continued, her voice now carrying the authority of someone accustomed to having her commands obeyed. "Before you embarrass yourself any further. This isn't the kind of place where you can just walk in and pretend to be something you're not." "I'm not pretending to be anything," Celeste said, but her voice was weaker now, shaken by the sustained attack on her dignity. "Oh, please," Patricia said with a dismissive wave of her hand. "We both know what this is. You saw an opportunity to sneak into a fancy restaurant, probably hoping to catch the attention of some wealthy man who might be impressed by your little charade. Well, let me save you the trouble. It's not working. Everyone here can see exactly what you are." The words hit Celeste like acid. The implication that she was some kind of gold digger, someone trying to trick her way into wealth and status, was so far from the truth it was almost absurd. But the way Patricia said it, with such conviction and authority, made Celeste question everything about herself. "You don't know anything about me," Celeste whispered. "I know enough," Patricia replied coldly. "I know you don't belong here. I know you're making everyone uncomfortable with your presence. And I know that the longer you sit there pretending to be something you're not, the more pathetic you look." Patricia leaned closer then, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper that only Celeste could hear. "Let me make this simple for you. Leave now, quietly, and maybe you can salvage what's left of your dignity. Keep sitting there, and I'll make sure everyone in this restaurant knows exactly what kind of person you really are." The threat hung in the air between them like a loaded weapon. Celeste felt trapped, cornered by a predator who seemed to take genuine pleasure in her discomfort. Every instinct told her to stand up and walk away, to escape this nightmare before it got worse. But something deeper, something stronger, kept her seated. Maybe it was the memory of Adrian's words about belonging everywhere he belonged. Maybe it was the thought of all the times she'd been forced to back down, to make herself smaller, to accept less than she deserved. Or maybe it was simply the knowledge that she had done nothing wrong, nothing to deserve this treatment. "I'm not leaving," Celeste said quietly but firmly. "I have every right to be here, and I'm not going anywhere." Patricia's face flushed red with rage. The rejection of her authority, the refusal to be cowed, seemed to trigger something primal and violent in her. For a moment, Celeste thought the woman might simply storm away, but instead, Patricia's voice rose to a level that ensured everyone in the restaurant could hear her next words. "How dare you speak to me that way?" Patricia shrieked. "Do you have any idea who I am? I will not be insulted by some nobody who doesn't even belong in the same zip code as this restaurant." And then, before Celeste could react, before anyone could intervene, Patricia's hand flew through the air with vicious speed and connected with Celeste's cheek in a slap that echoed through the now silent dining room like a gunshot. The sound seemed to freeze time itself, And in that crystalline moment of impact, Patricia Hartwell had just made the biggest mistake of her life. The silence that followed the slap was deafening. For a heartbeat, the entire dining room of Spago, Beverly Hills seemed suspended in time, as if the very air had crystallized around the moment of impact. Celeste's cheek burned with a fire that seemed to spread through her entire body, the sting of Patricia's hand nothing compared to the deeper wound of public humiliation. Celeste's right hand instinctively rose to touch her cheek, her fingers trembling as they encountered the heat radiating from where Patricia's palm had connected. The sensation was surreal, almost dreamlike in its intensity. She could taste copper in her mouth where her teeth had cut the inside of her lip, and her left ear rang with a high-pitched whine that made the world sound muffled and distant. Around them, the restaurant had transformed into a theater of shocked faces and whispered gasps. Forks remained suspended halfway to mouths, wine glasses held frozen in mid-sip, and conversations died so completely that the soft jazz playing through the sound system suddenly seemed thunderously loud. Every eye in the dining room was fixed on their table, some faces showing horror, others displaying the kind of morbid fascination people felt when witnessing a car accident. Patricia Hartwell stood over Celeste like a conquering general, her chest heaving with righteous indignation and her blue eyes blazing with satisfaction. Her perfectly manicured hand was still slightly raised from the blow, and there was something almost feral in her expression, as if the act of violence had released something primitive and savage within her. "There," Patricia said, her voice carrying clearly across the silent dining room. "Maybe now you'll understand that actions have consequences. You can't just waltz into places where you don't belong and expect to be treated like you matter." Celeste felt tears building behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Not here. Not in front of this woman and all these staring faces. The humiliation was overwhelming, a crushing weight that seemed to press down on her from all sides. Part of her wanted to run, to flee this nightmare and never look back. But a deeper part, the part that had survived growing up poor in Detroit, the part that had worked 3 jobs to put herself through college, refused to give Patricia the satisfaction. "You hit me," Celeste said, her voice barely above a whisper but somehow carrying clearly in the absolute silence of the restaurant. The words felt strange coming out of her mouth, as if speaking them made the assault real in a way that the physical sensation hadn't. "I defended myself," Patricia replied coldly, smoothing down her white Chanel dress as if the act of violence had somehow disheveled her perfectly maintained appearance. "You were being aggressive and threatening. Everyone here witnessed it." The lie was so blatant, so completely divorced from reality, that Celeste felt a new kind of shock wash over her. Patricia was actually rewriting history in real time, attempting to transform herself from aggressor to victim even as Celeste's cheek continued to throb with pain. "I never threatened you," Celeste said, her voice growing stronger despite the tears that threatened to spill over. "I was sitting at my table, eating dinner. You approached me. You attacked me." "Oh, please," Patricia scoffed, turning to address the watching crowd as if they were a jury she needed to convince. "Did anyone else see how hostile she became when I simply tried to have a polite conversation? The way she raised her voice and became aggressive." A few of the nearby diners shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their eyes darting between Patricia and Celeste. Celeste could see the calculations happening behind their eyes, the way they were weighing social status and appearances against truth. Patricia's expensive clothes, her confident demeanor, her obvious wealth and social connections carried weight in this world that Celeste's simple dress and quiet dignity simply couldn't match. "She was perfectly polite," said a voice from a table near the window. An elderly man with kind eyes and graying hair had spoken up, his voice cutting through Patricia's attempted narrative like a knife. "I saw the whole thing. This young lady never raised her voice or acted aggressively. You, madam, were the one who approached her table uninvited." Patricia's face flushed red with anger at this contradiction to her story. "I don't know what you think you saw, but this woman was clearly out of line. She doesn't belong here, and everyone knows it." "What I know," the elderly man replied firmly, "is that I just watched you assault someone half your size for no reason other than your own prejudice." Other diners began to murmur among themselves, the spell of shocked silence finally breaking. Celeste could hear fragments of conversation floating around her. Did she really just hit her? Over what? I couldn't hear what they were saying. That poor girl. She looks terrified. Patricia Hartwell always was a piece of work. The last comment made Patricia whip around, her eyes scanning the room to identify who had spoken. I'll have you know that my family has been part of this community for generations, she announced loudly. We don't need lectures about proper behavior from people who clearly don't understand the social dynamics at play here. Celeste slowly rose from her chair, her legs shaky but her resolve hardening. The movement drew every eye back to her, and she could feel the weight of their attention like a physical force. Her cheek still burned, and she was certain there would be a mark, but something inside her had shifted. The scared little girl from Detroit was gone, replaced by a woman who had survived too much to be broken by Patricia Hartwell's cruelty. Social dynamics. Celeste repeated, her voice clear and strong. Is that what you call racism and assault? The word racism seemed to electrify the room. Several diners gasped audibly, and Patricia's face went from flushed red to pale white in an instant. How dare you, Patricia hissed. How dare you play the race card when you're the one who doesn't belong here? This has nothing to do with race and everything to do with class and proper behavior. You told me people like me don't belong here, Celeste said, her voice growing stronger with each word. You judged me based on my appearance and decided I wasn't worthy of basic human respect. You attacked me because you thought I was powerless to fight back. What would you call that? I would call it reality, Patricia snapped back. Some people understand their place in the world, and some people need to be reminded of it. You clearly fall into the second category. The cruelty in Patricia's words was breathtaking. Even some of the diners who had initially seemed sympathetic to Patricia's position were now looking uncomfortable with her continued aggression. The elderly man who had spoken up earlier was shaking his head in disgust. Where is the manager? Patricia suddenly demanded, turning away from Celeste to scan the restaurant. I want this woman removed immediately. She's creating a disturbance and making threats. As if summoned by her words, a nervous-looking man in a perfectly pressed suit appeared at their table. He was clearly the restaurant manager, his face pale with the horror of having a public scene unfold in his establishment. His eyes darted between Patricia and Celeste, clearly trying to assess the situation and determine the best course of action. Mrs. Hartwell, he said carefully, perhaps we could discuss this matter privately in my office? There's nothing to discuss privately, Patricia replied imperiously. This woman doesn't belong here, and I want her removed. Now. The manager's eyes flicked to Celeste, taking in her simple dress, her obvious distress, and the red mark on her cheek that was already beginning to darken. Ma'am, he said gently, perhaps I could arrange for you to be seated in a different section of the restaurant? The suggestion felt like a knife in Celeste's heart. Even the manager, faced with clear evidence of assault, was ready to move her rather than confront Patricia. The injustice of it made her feel sick. I'm not moving, Celeste said firmly. I was assaulted while sitting peacefully at my table. I haven't done anything wrong. She's being dramatic, Patricia interjected. I barely touched her, and I only did so because she was becoming aggressive and making me feel threatened. The mark on her face suggests otherwise. The elderly man called out from his table. And I'd be happy to testify to that fact if necessary. Patricia whirled around to face him again. No one asked for your opinion, old man. This is between me and this woman who thinks she can con her way into places she doesn't belong. Con. Celeste repeated, the word hitting her like another slap. What exactly do you think I'm trying to con? Please, Patricia said with a dismissive laugh. The mysterious husband who's conveniently absent? The sob story about belonging here? We both know what this is. You're probably hoping to seduce some wealthy man, or maybe you're planning to sue the restaurant for some imagined slight. Either way, your little scheme isn't going to work. The accusation was so outrageous, so completely divorced from reality, that Celeste felt her anger finally override her shock and pain. This woman had not only physically assaulted her but was now attacking her character and integrity in front of a room full of strangers. "You don't know anything about me," Celeste said, her voice ringing with authority that surprised even her. "You made assumptions based on prejudice and ignorance, and when I didn't submit to your bullying, you resorted to violence. That says everything about your character and nothing about mine." Patricia's face contorted with rage. "Character? Don't lecture me about character when you're sitting here playing dress-up in a restaurant you could never afford, spinning lies about husbands who don't exist." It was at that moment, as Patricia's voice reached its peak of vicious triumph, that the soft murmur of the crowd suddenly stopped entirely. Celeste saw Patricia's eyes widen slightly as she registered something behind Celeste, and when Celeste turned to see what had captured everyone's attention, her heart nearly stopped. Adrian was walking toward their table, his face a mask of controlled fury that Celeste had never seen before. His green eyes were locked on Patricia with an intensity that made several nearby diners instinctively lean away from their path. Every step he took seemed to charge the air with electricity, and Celeste could practically feel the temperature in the room drop several degrees. Patricia, however, seemed to interpret his approach differently. A smile of vindication spread across her face as she assumed he was coming to support her position. "Thank God," Patricia said loudly enough for everyone to hear. Finally, someone with authority. "Sir, please tell this woman that she needs to leave immediately. She's been causing nothing but trouble since she arrived." Adrian stopped directly beside Celeste, his eyes never leaving Patricia's face. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but carried such menace that it seemed to echo off the walls. "Did you just put your hands on my wife?" The words hung in the air like a thunderclap, reverberating through the stunned silence of Spago, Beverly Hills with devastating clarity. Patricia Hartwell's triumphant smile froze on her face, then slowly melted away as the meaning of Adrian's words penetrated her consciousness. Her mouth opened and closed soundlessly, like a fish suddenly yanked from water, while her eyes darted between Adrian's imposing figure and Celeste's tear-stained face. Your wife," Patricia stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. The color drained from her face so rapidly that her expertly applied makeup stood out like war paint against suddenly pale skin. Adrian stepped closer to Celeste, his hand moving to rest protectively on her shoulder. The gesture was gentle when directed toward his wife, but his eyes remained fixed on Patricia with the cold intensity of a predator studying prey. At 6 feet 2 inches and radiating barely contained fury, he seemed to fill the entire space around their table. "My wife," Adrian repeated, his voice gaining volume and steel with each syllable. "Celeste Williams. The woman you just assaulted in front of a room full of witnesses." The collective gasp from the surrounding diners was audible. Heads turned and whispers exploded like popcorn as the magnitude of Patricia's mistake began to register throughout the restaurant. Several people pulled out their phones, some clearly Googling Adrian's name while others appeared to be texting frantically. "Adrian Williams," someone whispered loudly enough to be heard. "Oh my God, that's Adrian Williams from Nexus Innovations. The billionaire tech guy? She hit a billionaire's wife." Patricia's legs seemed to give out slightly, and she gripped the back of a nearby chair for support. The blood had completely drained from her face, leaving her looking almost ghostly under the warm restaurant lighting. Her perfectly manicured hand trembled as she pressed it to her throat. I didn't know," Patricia whispered, then immediately seemed to realize how that sounded. "I mean, she didn't look like." "Like what?" Adrian's voice cut through her, stammering like a blade. He moved slightly, positioning himself more fully between Patricia and Celeste, his body language screaming protection and barely restrained violence. "She didn't look like she deserved basic human respect. She didn't look like she belonged in the same space as you." Every word Adrian spoke seemed to land on Patricia like a physical blow. She flinched with each question, her eyes darting around the restaurant as if looking for an escape route. But there was nowhere to run. Every table, every face, every pair of eyes was focused entirely on their confrontation. The restaurant manager, who had been frozen in horror since Adrian's arrival, suddenly sprang into action. "Mr. Williams," he said, his voice shaking slightly, "I am so terribly sorry. If I had known Mrs. Williams was your wife, this never would have." "If you had known—" Adrian turned his attention to the manager, and the man actually took a step backward. "Are you suggesting that my wife deserved to be treated this way because you didn't recognize her? That assault is acceptable as long as the victim isn't wealthy enough." "No, sir, absolutely not," the manager said quickly, sweat beading on his forehead despite the restaurant's comfortable temperature. "I meant no disrespect. We have the highest regard for all our guests." "Clearly not all your guests," Adrian said coldly, his hand moving to gently touch the red mark on Celeste's cheek. The tender gesture, so at odds with the fury radiating from every other part of his body, made several women in the dining room gasp audibly. Patricia seemed to find her voice again, though it came out as more of a croak. "I had no idea who she was. She was dressed so casually. How was I supposed to know?" The words were perhaps the worst thing she could have said. Adrian's eyes, which had been cold before, now turned absolutely arctic. When he spoke, his voice was so quiet that people at nearby tables had to strain to hear him, but the menace in his tone was unmistakable. "So you admit that you judged my wife based on her appearance? You decided that because she wasn't wearing expensive enough clothes, she didn't deserve respect. You thought that because she chose to dress modestly, she was somehow less worthy of basic human dignity." "That's not what I meant," Patricia said desperately, but her voice lacked any conviction. Everyone in the restaurant could see the truth written across her face. "Then what did you mean?" Adrian asked, his voice still dangerously quiet. "Explain to me, Mrs. Hartwell, exactly what gave you the right to approach my wife, berate her, humiliate her in public, and then put your hands on her." The use of her name seemed to shock Patricia even further. She clearly hadn't expected Adrian to know who she was, and the realization that he did seemed to add another layer of terror to her already overwhelming panic. "We've never been introduced," Patricia said weakly. "How do you know my name?" "I make it my business to know everyone who matters in this city," Adrian replied. "And more importantly, I make it my business to know everyone who might pose a threat to my family. Your husband, Gregory Hartwell, owns Hartwell Properties. Your family has significant investments in several businesses throughout Beverly Hills. You sit on the board of 3 different charities and consider yourself a pillar of this community." Each fact Adrian recited seemed to drain more color from Patricia's face. The realization that he knew exactly who she was, that this wasn't some random encounter with a stranger, was clearly terrifying her. "You also," Adrian continued, his voice growing harder, "have a reputation for exactly this kind of behavior. This isn't the first time you've used your perceived social status to bully people you consider beneath you. But it's going to be the last." The threat was unmistakable, and Patricia seemed to shrink physically under the weight of it. Around them, the restaurant had become completely silent except for the soft jazz still playing through the sound system, creating a surreal soundtrack to the unfolding drama. "Please," Patricia whispered, her voice breaking. "I made a mistake. I'm sorry. I didn't mean." "You didn't mean to get caught," Adrian corrected her. "You didn't mean to discover that your victim had the power to fight back. But you absolutely meant to humiliate and degrade someone you thought was powerless." Celeste watched this exchange with a mixture of awe and concern. She had never seen her husband like this before, had never witnessed the full force of his power and authority directed at another human being. It was simultaneously thrilling and terrifying to see how completely he could dominate a situation when protecting someone he loved. "Adrian," Celeste said softly, placing her hand on his arm. She could feel the tension in his muscles, could sense how close he was to completely losing control. "Maybe we should." "No," Adrian said firmly, but his voice gentled slightly when he looked at her. "You were assaulted, sweetheart, in public, by someone who thought you couldn't fight back. That's not something we're going to quietly ignore." He turned his attention back to Patricia, who was now openly crying, her perfect makeup running in black streaks down her cheeks. "Mrs. Hartwell, you have exactly one opportunity to explain yourself. Why did you think it was acceptable to put your hands on my wife?" Patricia's mouth opened and closed several times before any sound came out. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. She didn't look like she belonged here. I assumed. "You assumed that gave you the right to assault her," Adrian finished coldly. "I barely touched her," Patricia said desperately, but even as the words left her mouth, she seemed to realize how pathetic they sounded. "The mark on her face suggests otherwise," said the elderly man who had spoken up earlier. His voice carried clearly across the silent restaurant. "And I'd be happy to testify to exactly what I witnessed if legal action is pursued." The mention of legal action seemed to hit Patricia like a physical blow. She swayed on her feet, gripping the chair even tighter to keep from falling. "Legal action," she whispered. "You can't. I mean, surely we can work this out privately. Between civilized people." "Civilized people don't assault others in restaurants," Adrian replied. "Civilized people don't judge others based on their clothing or skin color. Civilized people don't assume that wealth gives them the right to treat others as less than human." The dining room remained frozen in tableau, every eye fixed on the confrontation. Cell phones were now openly recording, and Celeste realized that within hours, this entire scene would likely be all over social media. The thought should have horrified her, but instead she felt a strange sense of satisfaction. Let the world see what Patricia Hartwell really was. What would you do if you witnessed someone being treated this way? Have you ever stood up to a bully? Share your thoughts in the comments, and make sure to like this video if you believe everyone deserves respect regardless of how they're dressed. "Please," Patricia begged, her voice now completely broken. "My husband, my family, if this gets out." "You should have thought about your family before you decided to assault mine," Adrian replied without mercy. The confrontation was far from over, and Patricia Hartwell was about to discover that some mistakes carry consequences that money and social status cannot undo. Adrian's mention of consequences seemed to trigger something desperate in Patricia Hartwell. Her tears were flowing freely now, creating dark rivers of mascara down her cheeks as she clutched the chair back with white-knuckled hands. The transformation from entitled socialite to terrified woman was so complete that several diners were shifting uncomfortably in their seats, unsure whether to feel satisfaction or pity. "You don't understand," Patricia said, her voice cracking with desperation. "This will destroy everything my family has worked for. My husband's business relationships, our standing in the community, our children's futures. Please, there has to be another way to handle this." Adrian's expression remained unmoved. "The same way you considered my wife's feelings when you decided to humiliate her? The same way you thought about consequences when you raised your hand to strike her?" As Patricia continued to plead, Celeste found herself studying her husband's face. She had seen Adrian negotiate billion-dollar deals, had watched him command boardrooms full of powerful executives, but this was different. This was personal in a way that business never could be. The protective fury radiating from him was unlike anything she had ever witnessed. "Celeste," Adrian said softly, never taking his eyes off Patricia, "I want you to tell everyone here exactly what happened. From the beginning." Celeste took a shaky breath, her hand instinctively moving to touch the tender spot on her cheek where Patricia's slap had landed. The pain had dulled to a constant throb, but the humiliation still burned fresh and raw. "I was sitting at our table, waiting for Adrian to finish his phone call," Celeste began, her voice quiet but clear enough to carry throughout the silent restaurant. "Mrs. Hartwell approached me and said there had been some kind of mistake. She told me I was lost, that people like me don't belong in places like this." Several diners nodded, remembering the beginning of the confrontation they had witnessed. The elderly man who had spoken up earlier was listening intently, his face grave with disapproval. "She said I couldn't afford to eat here," Celeste continued, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. "She mocked my clothes, called them cheap. She said I was playing some kind of game, pretending to be something I wasn't. When I told her I was waiting for my husband, she laughed and said he was convenient fiction. Patricia's face crumpled further with each word Celeste spoke. I didn't mean it that way, she whispered, but her protest sounded hollow even to her own ears. Then she told me I was trying to con someone, Celeste said, her eyes meeting Patricia's directly for the first time since Adrian's arrival. She said I was either looking for a wealthy man to seduce or planning to sue the restaurant. She called me pathetic and told me to leave before I embarrassed myself further. The collective intake of breath from the surrounding diners was audible. Even those who hadn't heard the entire confrontation were beginning to understand the depth of Patricia's cruelty. And when I refused to leave, Celeste continued, her voice never wavering, when I told her I had every right to be here, she became furious. She started screaming about how dare I speak to her that way, about knowing my place. And then she hit me. The simple recounting of events seemed to have more impact than any dramatic flourish could have achieved. The facts spoke for themselves, laying bare the ugliness of Patricia's actions in stark, undeniable terms. Adrian moved closer to his wife, his hand finding hers and squeezing gently. What my wife isn't telling you, he said, his voice carrying easily through the restaurant, is that this kind of treatment isn't new to her. She's faced this kind of prejudice and assumptions her entire life. Celeste looked up at her husband in surprise. They had talked about her past, of course, but Adrian had never spoken about it publicly before. She could see something shifting in his expression, a decision being made. My wife grew up in Detroit, Adrian said, his voice filled with pride and love that stood in stark contrast to the fury still simmering beneath the surface. Her mother worked 3 jobs to keep food on the table after her father died when Celeste was 8 years old. Celeste herself worked from the time she was 14, helping to support her family while maintaining straight A's in school. Patricia's sobbing had quieted slightly as she listened, perhaps beginning to understand the magnitude of her misjudgment. She put herself through Wayne State University, Adrian continued, working nights at a diner and weekends at a laundromat. She graduated summa cum laude with a degree in education and dedicated her life to helping underprivileged children learn to read. When I met her 3 years ago, she was making $28,000 a year and donating half her vacation time to volunteer literacy programs. The picture Adrian was painting stood in such sharp contrast to Patricia's accusations that several diners were shaking their heads in disgust. The woman Patricia had dismissed as a gold digger and con artist was revealed to be someone who had dedicated her life to service and education. She has never asked me for anything, Adrian said, his voice growing softer but no less intense. When I proposed, she insisted on keeping her job for 6 months because she didn't want to abandon her students mid-semester. When we married, she donated her entire wardrobe to a women's shelter because she said other people needed the clothes more than she did. Celeste felt tears welling up in her eyes, but these were different from the tears of humiliation she had fought back earlier. These were tears of love and gratitude for a husband who saw her so clearly, who understood her so completely. The dress she's wearing tonight? Adrian gestured toward Celeste's simple navy outfit. She chose it specifically because she wanted to be comfortable, because she doesn't believe in wasting money on expensive clothes when that money could be used to help people who actually need it. She has a closet full of designer gowns that I've bought her, but she prefers to dress like the woman I fell in love with. The woman who would rather spend $1,000 feeding hungry families than buying a handbag. Patricia's legs finally gave out completely, and she sank into the chair she had been gripping. Her perfect facade had completely crumbled, leaving behind a broken woman who was beginning to understand the true cost of her actions. Mrs. Hartwell, Adrian said, turning his full attention back to Patricia, you judged my wife based on her skin color and her clothes. You decided that because she didn't look wealthy enough for your standards, she didn't deserve basic human respect. You assaulted her because you thought she was powerless to fight back. I'm sorry, Patricia whispered, the words barely audible. I'm so sorry. I never meant. I didn't know. You didn't know that she was married to someone who could destroy you? Adrian asked coldly. Or you didn't know that she was a human being who deserved better treatment regardless of her circumstances. The distinction was brutal in its clarity, and Patricia seemed to realize that any answer she gave would only make things worse for her. 3 years ago, Adrian continued, his voice taking on a different tone, I was sitting in a coffee shop in Westwood, burned out from work and questioning whether anything I was building actually mattered. I overheard a conversation between my wife and a barista about literacy rates in low-income communities. Celeste was so passionate, so knowledgeable, so completely committed to making a difference that I found myself eavesdropping. A small smile played at the corners of Adrian's mouth as he recalled the memory. She was wearing a $15 dress from Target and shoes that had clearly been resold multiple times. She was beautiful, but more than that, she was real in a way I'd never encountered before. When I finally worked up the courage to introduce myself, she spent 20 minutes talking about her students before she even asked what I did for work. The love in Adrian's voice was unmistakable, and Celeste felt her heart swelling with emotion. Even in the midst of this confrontation, he was telling their love story. When she found out I was worth more money than she could imagine, Adrian continued, her first question wasn't about my house or my cars or my lifestyle. She asked if I would consider funding a literacy program for at-risk children. She cared more about my potential to help others than my ability to provide for her. Patricia was crying openly now, her hands covering her face as the full weight of her mistake crashed down on her. Around them, diners were wiping away tears of their own, moved by the story of genuine love and partnership that Adrian was sharing. That, Adrian said, his voice hardening again as he looked directly at Patricia, is the woman you just assaulted. That is the person you decided wasn't worthy of respect. And now you're going to learn what happens when someone attacks my family. The promise of consequences hung in the air like storm clouds, and Patricia Hartwell was about to discover that her nightmare was just beginning. The raw emotion in Adrian's voice as he spoke about their love story seemed to shift something fundamental in the atmosphere of Spago, Beverly Hills. The anger and tension that had dominated the scene began to transform into something deeper, more profound. Celeste watched her husband's face as he spoke, seeing not the intimidating billionaire who had just reduced Patricia Hartwell to tears, but the gentle man who had fallen in love with her passion for helping others. Adrian turned his attention fully to Celeste, his green eyes softening as they met hers. Without a word, he gently took her face in his hands, his thumbs tracing careful paths along her cheekbones as he examined the red mark Patricia's slap had left behind. His touch was feather-light, reverent, as if she were made of the most delicate porcelain. "Does it hurt badly?" he asked softly, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear. The public confrontation seemed to fade away as he focused entirely on his wife's well-being. "It stings," Celeste admitted, leaning into his touch. "But I'm okay. Really." Adrian's jaw tightened slightly, and she could see the effort it took for him to keep his anger in check. "You shouldn't have had to endure that. Any of it. I should have been here." "You couldn't have known," Celeste said, placing her hand over his. "And I'm proud of how I handled it. I didn't back down, even when she tried to make me feel small." A smile of fierce pride crossed Adrian's face. "You were magnificent. Watching you stand up to her, refuse to be intimidated. I've never been more proud to call you my wife." Their intimate moment was interrupted by a soft clearing of throat. The restaurant manager stood nearby, his face pale with anxiety and his hands clasped nervously in front of him. Behind him, several other staff members hovered uncertainly, clearly wanting to help but unsure how to proceed. "Mr. Williams," the manager said carefully, "please allow me to personally apologize for what happened in our establishment. This is absolutely not the kind of environment we strive to maintain. We pride ourselves on treating all our guests with equal respect and dignity." Adrian straightened but kept one protective arm around Celeste's shoulders. "Your staff isn't responsible for the actions of your customers, Robert," he said, clearly familiar with the manager. "But how you handle this situation will determine whether my family ever feels safe dining here again." The manager, Robert, nodded quickly. "Of course, sir. We want to do whatever is necessary to make this right." Perhaps we could comp your meal tonight, and we'd be honored to have you as our guests for any future visits. That's a start, Adrian said carefully, but this isn't about money. This is about ensuring that what happened to my wife never happens to anyone else in your restaurant. Patricia, who had been sitting in shocked silence, suddenly looked up with desperate hope in her eyes. Yes, she said quickly, that's exactly right. This was an isolated incident. A terrible misunderstanding that got out of hand. Surely we can all agree that what's important now is moving forward constructively. The attempt to reframe the assault as a mere misunderstanding caused Adrian's expression to harden again. Mrs. Hartwell, there was no misunderstanding. You made conscious choices based on prejudice and entitlement. The only reason you're calling it a misunderstanding now is because you discovered your victim wasn't as powerless as you assumed. Celeste squeezed Adrian's hand, feeling the tension building in his body again. She could see that his protective instincts were warring with his business sense, and she knew she needed to help guide this situation toward a resolution that would actually mean something. Adrian, she said softly, may I say something? He looked down at her, his expression immediately gentling. Of course. This is about you more than anyone else. Celeste stood slowly, Adrian's arm still around her shoulders, and faced the room full of watching diners. Many of them had their phones out, some clearly recording, others scrolling through social media. She could see the mixture of emotions on their faces: sympathy, curiosity, embarrassment, and in some cases, recognition that they might have reacted similarly to Patricia in different circumstances. I want everyone here to understand something, Celeste began, her voice clear and steady. What happened tonight wasn't about money or social status. It was about basic human dignity. Mrs. Hartwell didn't know who I was married to when she decided I didn't belong here. She made that judgment based purely on my appearance and her own assumptions. Several diners nodded, clearly following her reasoning. Patricia sat frozen, her tear-streaked face turned toward Celeste with an expression of desperate attention. The problem isn't that she didn't recognize me as a billionaire's wife, Celeste continued. The problem is that she thought it was acceptable to treat anyone the way she treated me. If I had been a struggling single mother saving up for a special dinner, would that have made her behavior any less wrong? The question hung in the air, and Celeste could see several people in the restaurant shifting uncomfortably as they considered it. She was forcing them to confront the uncomfortable truth that Patricia's actions would have been equally despicable regardless of Celeste's circumstances. I grew up poor, Celeste said, her voice gaining strength. I know what it feels like to walk into places where people judge you before you even speak. I know what it's like to have people assume you don't belong, that you're somehow less worthy of respect because of how you look or what you're wearing. Adrian's arm tightened around her shoulders, his love and support radiating through his touch. She could feel his pride in her courage, his admiration for her willingness to turn this painful experience into a teaching moment. What Mrs. Hartwell did tonight was assault me because she thought I couldn't fight back, Celeste continued. She thought she could humiliate and degrade someone she perceived as powerless, and that there would be no consequences for her actions. Patricia made a small, wounded sound, but Celeste pressed on. But here's what she didn't understand, Celeste said, her voice growing stronger. My worth isn't determined by my husband's bank account or my clothes or anything else that can be seen from the outside. My worth comes from how I treat people, how I contribute to the world, how I choose to live my life. The elderly man who had defended her earlier began to clap slowly, and gradually other diners joined in. The applause wasn't thunderous, but it was sincere, and Celeste felt tears of gratitude welling up in her eyes. Thank you, she said simply, then turned to look directly at Patricia. Mrs. Hartwell, I accept your apology. But an apology isn't enough. Actions have consequences, and those consequences need to mean something. Patricia looked up hopefully, clearly expecting some form of mercy or forgiveness that would allow her to escape the situation with minimal damage. I want you to spend the next 6 months volunteering at a literacy center in an underprivileged community, Celeste said firmly. I want you to see the real faces of the people you dismissed tonight. I want you to understand that worth and dignity aren't luxuries that only wealthy people deserve." The request clearly shocked Patricia. "Volunteer work," she said weakly. I don't know anything about that kind of thing." "Then you'll learn," Celeste replied without sympathy. "You'll learn what it means to serve others instead of expecting to be served. You'll learn what real character looks like." Adrian looked down at his wife with undisguised admiration. "That's perfect," he said softly. "Justice with purpose." "But if you refuse," Celeste continued, her voice hardening, "or if you try to use your volunteer work as a photo opportunity to rehabilitate your image, then my husband and I will pursue every legal avenue available to us. We'll make sure everyone knows exactly what kind of person you really are." The threat was delivered with quiet dignity, but its impact was unmistakable. Patricia understood that she was being offered a choice: genuine redemption through service, or complete social and legal destruction. "I'll do it," Patricia whispered. "The volunteer work. I'll do whatever you ask." "Good," Celeste said simply. "Because this isn't just about you anymore. This is about making sure that no one else has to experience what I experienced tonight." Adrian pressed a gentle kiss to the top of Celeste's head. "I love you," he whispered. "More than ever." The confrontation was far from over, but Celeste had transformed it from a simple case of revenge into something much more meaningful: a chance for real change and growth. The moment of grace and forgiveness that had filled Spago, Beverly Hills seemed to hang in the air like morning mist, beautiful but fragile. Patricia Hartwell sat in her chair, tears still streaming down her face, nodding eagerly at Celeste's offer of redemption through community service. For a brief instant, it appeared that the evening might end with genuine reconciliation and the possibility of real change. Then Patricia's phone buzzed loudly against the table where she had placed it earlier. The sound seemed to break whatever spell had held the restaurant in respectful silence. Patricia glanced at the screen, and Celeste watched as the woman's expression shifted dramatically. The grateful, remorseful mask slipped away, replaced by something calculating and cold. Patricia's eyes darted around the room, taking in the dozens of phones still recording, the faces of prominent Beverly Hills residents who had witnessed her humiliation, and the potential social media nightmare that was undoubtedly already beginning to unfold. "Actually," Patricia said, her voice suddenly steadier and laced with familiar arrogance, "I think I need to reconsider this situation." Adrian's arm tightened protectively around Celeste's shoulders. "Reconsider what, exactly?" Patricia stood slowly, smoothing down her white Chanel dress and attempting to regain some semblance of her earlier commanding presence. The makeup streaks on her face and the obvious tremor in her hands undermined the effect, but there was a desperate determination in her voice as she spoke. "I've been sitting here listening to threats and ultimatums," Patricia said, her tone growing stronger with each word. "But I'm starting to remember exactly who I am and what kind of influence my family has in this community." A collective murmur rippled through the watching diners. Several people exchanged concerned glances, sensing that the fragile peace was about to shatter completely. "Mrs. Hartwell," Celeste said carefully, "we offered you a chance to make this right, to learn and grow from what happened tonight." "Learn and grow." Patricia laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "From whom? A woman who couldn't even afford proper clothes for dinner at Spago? You may have fooled my husband into marrying you," she said, pointing a perfectly manicured finger at Celeste, "but I know exactly what you are." The words hit the restaurant like a physical blow. Gasps echoed from multiple tables, and Adrian went completely still beside Celeste. When he spoke, his voice was deadly quiet. "What did you just say?" Patricia seemed to draw strength from his reaction, as if his anger validated her decision to abandon any pretense of remorse. "I said what everyone in this room is thinking, but is too polite to say out loud. Your wife is a gold digger who got lucky. She played the long game, probably planned the whole thing from the moment she found out who you were." "Stop talking," Adrian said, his voice carrying such menace that several nearby diners instinctively leaned away from their table. But Patricia was beyond caution now, her panic and humiliation transforming into a desperate counterattack. "No, I won't stop talking. I've spent the last hour being lectured and threatened, but I'm done pretending this is about respect or dignity. This is about a nobody who seduced a rich man and now thinks she's untouchable." Celeste felt each word like a knife blade sliding between her ribs. The accusations weren't just cruel, they were designed to destroy the very foundation of her relationship with Adrian. Patricia was weaponizing every insecurity Celeste had ever felt about their marriage, every moment of doubt about whether she truly belonged in Adrian's world. "You know what I think happened?" Patricia continued, her voice rising as she warmed to her theme. "I think little Celeste from Detroit did her research. I think she found out exactly where wealthy men like to spend their time, and she positioned herself perfectly to seem like a chance encounter." "That's enough," Adrian said, starting to step forward, but Celeste caught his arm. "No," Celeste said quietly, her voice barely audible but somehow carrying clearly through the restaurant. "Let her finish. Let everyone hear what she really thinks." Patricia smiled triumphantly at what she interpreted as encouragement. "The coffee shop story? Please. What are the odds that a struggling literacy teacher just happens to be in the same expensive Westwood cafe as a billionaire? She probably staked out that place for weeks, waiting for the perfect opportunity." The accusation was so outrageous, so completely divorced from reality, that several diners were shaking their heads in disgust. But Patricia pressed on, oblivious to the damage she was doing to herself with every word. "And the sob story about working 3 jobs and helping underprivileged children? Classic con artist technique. Make the mark feel like he's saving you, like he's the hero in your tragic story. Men with that much money always have savior complexes." Celeste felt her world tilting on its axis. She knew the accusations were false, knew that Adrian knew they were false, but hearing her entire life reduced to a calculated deception was devastating in ways she hadn't anticipated. The pain of it was sharp and immediate, cutting deeper than Patricia's physical slap had managed to do. "She's been playing you from day one," Patricia continued, encouraged by what she mistook for silence born of guilt rather than shock. "The modest clothes, the reluctance to spend money, the whole humble routine. It's all designed to make you think she's different from other women who might want your money." "You're insane," Adrian said, his voice shaking with barely controlled rage. "Am I?" Patricia shot back. "Then explain to me how a woman who supposedly cares so much about helping people has managed to become comfortable with a lifestyle that could fund entire school districts. Explain how someone with such strong principles about modest living has adapted so easily to mansion parties and private jets." The questions hit Celeste like arrows finding their mark. They were twisted versions of doubts she had wrestled with privately, concerns about whether she was becoming someone she didn't recognize, whether her principles were slowly eroding under the influence of Adrian's wealth. "She's got you completely fooled," Patricia said, pressing her advantage as she saw the pain in Celeste's eyes. "The perfect wife who doesn't want your money? Who just happens to be beautiful and articulate and everything you thought you wanted? It's all an act, Adrian. A very sophisticated, very successful act." "You don't know what you're talking about," Adrian said, but Celeste could hear something different in his voice now. Not doubt, exactly, but a kind of defensive uncertainty that suggested Patricia's words were having some effect. "Don't I?" Patricia laughed, the sound harsh and grating. "I've seen women like her before. They study their targets, learn exactly what buttons to push, what stories to tell. Your wife didn't fall in love with you, Adrian. She fell in love with your bank account and everything it could provide for her." The restaurant had gone completely silent again, but this time the atmosphere was thick with tension and discomfort rather than rapt attention. People were looking away, clearly uncomfortable with the vicious personal attack they were witnessing. "The literacy program," Patricia continued relentlessly. "The volunteer work. The donated clothes. It's all part of the image she's created to keep you convinced that she's genuine. But what has she actually sacrificed since marrying you? What has she given up? She lives in luxury while maintaining the illusion of humility." Celeste felt tears building behind her eyes, but they were different from the tears of humiliation she had felt earlier. These were tears of profound hurt, the kind that came from having her deepest fears and insecurities weaponized against her by someone who understood exactly where to strike for maximum damage. Every loving word, every grateful look, every moment of supposed selflessness, Patricia said, her voice dropping to a theatrical whisper that somehow carried throughout the entire restaurant. All of it calculated to keep you believing that you're married to a saint instead of a very clever opportunist. The silence that followed was deafening. Patricia stood there breathing heavily, her face flushed with the exertion of her attack, clearly believing she had scored a decisive victory. Around them, diners sat frozen in horrified fascination, unsure whether they had just witnessed a complete breakdown or the revelation of some terrible truth. Adrian was staring at his wife with an expression Celeste had never seen before. It wasn't doubt exactly, but there was something searching in his gaze, as if he was looking for reassurance that everything he believed about their love was real. And in that moment of searching, in that tiny pause before he spoke, Celeste felt something fundamental crack inside her chest. Not because she doubted their love, but because she realized that no matter how much they loved each other, there would always be people like Patricia Hartwell ready to poison that love with suspicion and doubt. The perfect storm of humiliation, pain, and soul-deep weariness finally overwhelmed her, and Celeste Williams broke. The crack that had started in Celeste's chest spread outward like ice fracturing on a frozen lake. She felt herself fragmenting under the weight of Patricia's accusations, not because they contained any truth, but because they had been designed with surgical precision to target every insecurity she had carried since the day she married Adrian Williams. "Stop," Celeste whispered, the word barely audible but somehow cutting through the charged atmosphere of the restaurant like a blade. "Just stop." She pulled away from Adrian's protective embrace, her movement so sudden and unexpected that he stumbled slightly. When she looked up at him, her dark eyes were bright with unshed tears, but there was something else there too. Something that looked dangerously close to defeat. "Celeste," Adrian said softly, reaching for her again, but she stepped backward, shaking her head. "No," she said, her voice growing stronger but carrying a note of profound exhaustion. "I can't do this anymore. I can't keep defending my love, my motives, my very existence to people who have already decided what I am." Patricia watched this exchange with undisguised satisfaction, clearly believing that her attack had achieved its intended purpose. The malicious smile playing at the corners of her mouth suggested she thought she had successfully planted enough doubt to destroy the Williams marriage from within. "Celeste, don't let her do this," Adrian said, his voice tight with desperation. "Don't let her poisonous words matter more than 3 years of our life together." "It's not about her words," Celeste replied, her voice breaking slightly. "It's about the fact that this will never end. There will always be another Patricia Hartwell, another person ready to assume the worst about me, another situation where I have to prove that I'm worthy of love." The watching diners shifted uncomfortably as they witnessed what appeared to be a marriage dissolving before their eyes. Several people had stopped recording, the voyeuristic thrill of the confrontation replaced by genuine discomfort at witnessing such intimate pain. "You don't have to prove anything to anyone," Adrian said, his voice carrying a note of pleading that made several women in the restaurant dab at their eyes with their napkins. "Not to her, not to them, not to anyone." "Don't I?" Celeste asked, gesturing toward the room full of watching faces. "Look at them, Adrian. Look at how they're watching us. Half of them are wondering if she might be right. Half of them are thinking that maybe there's some truth to what she's saying." Adrian's jaw clenched as he followed her gaze around the restaurant. She was right, and they both knew it. While most of the diners looked sympathetic or disgusted by Patricia's behavior, there were undeniably some faces that showed curiosity, speculation, and the kind of uncomfortable recognition that came from having similar thoughts. "I don't care what they think," Adrian said fiercely. "I care what you think. I care what we know to be true." "But I'm tired of fighting for that truth," Celeste said, her voice carrying 3 years of accumulated weariness. "I'm tired of walking into rooms and wondering who's going to judge me today. I'm tired of having to be perfect, having to be grateful, having to prove over and over again that I deserve to be here. Patricia, sensing an opportunity to drive the wedge deeper, spoke up from her position near the table. Finally, someone's being honest about the situation. This whole charade has been exhausting for everyone involved. Shut up, Adrian snapped without even looking at her, his entire focus concentrated on his wife. Celeste, please. Don't let her win. Don't let her destroy what we have. She's not destroying anything, Celeste said quietly. She's just forcing me to face something I've been avoiding for 3 years. The fact that I will never truly belong in your world, and I'm exhausted from trying to pretend otherwise. The admission hung in the air like a funeral shroud. Adrian looked as if she had physically struck him, his face going pale with shock and pain. That's not true, he said desperately. You belong everywhere I belong. You belong with me. Do I? Celeste asked, and the simple question contained years of doubt and struggle. Because I've spent 3 years feeling like I'm wearing a costume, trying to be someone I'm not sure I actually am. And tonight just proved that no matter how hard I try, there will always be people ready to see me as an outsider who doesn't belong. Around them, the restaurant had become completely silent. Even the soft jazz had stopped playing, leaving only the sound of Celeste's quiet voice and the occasional clink of ice in abandoned drinks. I never asked you to be anyone other than yourself, Adrian said, his voice raw with emotion. Didn't you? Celeste asked gently. Tonight, before we left the house, you wanted me to change clothes. You wanted me to dress more expensively, to look the part of a billionaire's wife. You've never demanded it, but the pressure has always been there. Adrian's face crumpled as he realized the truth in her words. I was trying to protect you. I didn't want people to treat you the way she treated you tonight. But protection isn't the same as acceptance, Celeste said softly. And I can't spend the rest of my life hiding behind expensive clothes and perfect manners, trying to armor myself against people like Patricia Hartwell. The elderly man who had defended Celeste earlier suddenly spoke up from his table. Young lady, he said, his voice carrying the authority of age and experience, if I may offer some perspective. Both Celeste and Adrian turned to look at him, along with everyone else in the restaurant. The man stood slowly, his dignity evident in every movement. I've been married for 53 years, he said, his voice clear and strong. In that time, I've learned that love isn't about belonging to someone else's world. It's about creating a world together that belongs to both of you. His words seemed to resonate through the restaurant, and Celeste felt something shift in her chest. That woman, he continued, nodding toward Patricia, attacked you because she recognized something in you that she envies. Authenticity. Genuine character. The kind of love that can't be bought or manufactured. Patricia opened her mouth to protest, but the elderly man's stern look silenced her immediately. Mrs. Williams, he said, addressing Celeste directly, I watched the entire confrontation tonight. I saw how you handled yourself with grace and dignity even when being attacked. I saw how your husband looked at you, not as an acquisition or a trophy, but as a true partner. That kind of love doesn't come from deception or calculation. It comes from recognizing something real and valuable in another person. Celeste felt tears streaming down her face, but they were different now. Not tears of pain or defeat, but tears of recognition and possibility. The choice you're facing isn't whether you belong in your husband's world, the elderly man continued. The choice is whether you're going to let other people's prejudices and assumptions dictate how you live your life and love your marriage. Adrian was watching Celeste intently, hope and fear warring in his expression. She could see that he was afraid to speak, afraid that anything he said might push her further away. I love you, Celeste said suddenly, the words bursting out of her like water breaking through a dam. I love you so much that it terrifies me sometimes. But I can't keep fighting the same battles over and over again. I can't keep proving that our love is real to people who will never believe it anyway. Then don't, Adrian said simply. Don't fight for them. Fight for us. Choose us. The choice hung in the air between them, weighted with 3 years of love and struggle, hope and doubt. Around them, the restaurant held its collective breath, waiting to see whether love would triumph over fear, whether connection would prove stronger than division. Have you ever felt like you had to prove you belonged somewhere? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories about love overcoming impossible odds. Celeste looked into her husband's eyes, seeing not judgment or doubt, but pure, unwavering love. And in that moment, she had to decide whether that love was worth fighting for, whether their shared future was more important than the opinions of people like Patricia Hartwell. The entire restaurant waited for her answer. Celeste stood in the hushed dining room of Spago, Beverly Hills, surrounded by watching faces and the weight of a decision that would define the rest of her life. The elderly man's words echoed in her mind. Choose whether other people's prejudices would dictate how she lived and loved. Adrian waited before her, his green eyes filled with such raw vulnerability that it took her breath away. In that crystalline moment, Celeste realized something fundamental had shifted inside her. The crack in her chest wasn't from breaking apart but from breaking open, like a seed splitting to allow new growth. Patricia Hartwell's vicious attack had inadvertently forced her to confront the very fears that had been holding her back from fully embracing her life with Adrian. "You're right," Celeste said softly, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I've been fighting the wrong battle. I've been trying to prove I belong to people whose opinions don't matter, instead of simply living the life I want with the man I love." Adrian's face transformed, hope blooming across his features like sunrise breaking through storm clouds. "I choose us," Celeste continued, stepping toward her husband. "I choose our love, our life, our future. And I choose to stop caring what people like Patricia Hartwell think about any of it." The relief that washed over Adrian's face was so profound that several diners actually applauded. He reached for Celeste, pulling her into his arms with a desperation that spoke of nearly losing the most precious thing in his world. "I love you," he whispered against her hair. "More than my next breath, more than anything in this world. We'll figure out the rest together." "Together," Celeste agreed, feeling the rightness of the word settle into her bones. Patricia Hartwell, who had been watching this reunion with growing horror, suddenly seemed to realize that her vicious gambit had not only failed but had actually strengthened the very bond she had tried to destroy. The color drained from her face as the full implications of her situation crashed down on her. "Wait," Patricia said desperately, her voice cracking with panic. "Please, you have to understand. I was upset. I wasn't thinking clearly. I said things I didn't mean." Adrian turned to face her, but he kept one arm firmly around Celeste's waist. When he spoke, his voice carried the cold authority of a man who had just watched someone try to destroy his marriage. "Mrs. Hartwell, you've shown us exactly who you are tonight. Twice. First, when you thought my wife was powerless, and again, when you tried to destroy our marriage out of spite. There are consequences for both." "Consequences," Patricia whispered, her hands trembling as she gripped the back of the chair. "My security team should be arriving any moment," Adrian said calmly, checking his watch. "They'll be escorting you out and ensuring that the proper authorities are notified of the assault that took place tonight." As if summoned by his words, 2 men in dark suits appeared at the restaurant's entrance. They were clearly professionals, moving with the kind of quiet confidence that suggested extensive training. The maitre d' spoke to them briefly before pointing toward their table. "Mr. Williams," the lead security officer said as they approached. "We came as soon as we received your message. Is this the individual who assaulted Mrs. Williams?" "It is," Adrian confirmed. Patricia shrank back as the 2 men flanked her position, their presence making any attempt at escape impossible. "Mrs. Hartwell," the security officer said formally, "you need to come with us. The Beverly Hills Police Department is waiting to speak with you about the incident tonight." "This is insane," Patricia said, her voice rising to near hysteria. "You can't arrest me for a simple misunderstanding. My husband will sue all of you for harassment." "Your husband," Adrian said quietly, "is about to have much bigger problems than a harassment lawsuit. You see, Patricia, Gregory Hartwell Properties has been trying to secure the contract for my new headquarters building for the past 8 months. The deal was supposed to be finalized next week. Patricia's face went ashen as she realized the implication. Was supposed to be, Adrian continued. Past tense. I'll be calling Gregory first thing tomorrow morning to inform him that Nexus Innovations will be taking our business elsewhere. I suspect that losing a $200 million contract might put a strain on your family's finances. You can't do that, Patricia whispered. That contract. It's the foundation of our expansion plans. Without it, Hartwell Properties will likely face significant financial difficulties, Adrian agreed without sympathy. Perhaps bankruptcy, depending on how leveraged Gregory has become in anticipation of the deal. The restaurant manager, Robert, stepped forward nervously. Mr. Williams, if I may. Mrs. Hartwell is also a significant investor in several establishments throughout Beverly Hills. If word of tonight's incident spreads... Oh, it will spread, Adrian said firmly. I'm not interested in covering this up or protecting her reputation. Actions have consequences, and Mrs. Hartwell needs to learn that lesson thoroughly. Patricia seemed to crumple in on herself as the full scope of her predicament became clear. The assault charge was just the beginning. Her family's business empire, their social standing, their entire way of life was about to come crashing down because of her actions tonight. Please, she begged, tears streaming down her face again. I have children. They don't deserve to suffer because of my mistakes. You should have thought about your children before you decided to assault my wife, Adrian replied coldly. But since you mention them, let me be clear about something. The volunteer work my wife proposed earlier? That offer is no longer on the table. You forfeited any chance at redemption when you tried to destroy our marriage. The elderly man who had spoken earlier approached their group, his expression grave but determined. Excuse me, he said, addressing Adrian and Celeste. I don't mean to intrude, but I wanted you to know that my wife and I witnessed everything that happened tonight. We'll be happy to provide statements to the police and testify in court if necessary. Several other diners nodded in agreement, rising from their tables to offer similar support. The collective gesture of solidarity was overwhelming, and Celeste felt tears of gratitude welling up in her eyes. Thank you, she said simply. All of you. Thank you for seeing the truth and being willing to stand up for it. As Patricia was led away by security, still pleading for mercy that would not come, Adrian turned his full attention back to his wife. The crisis was over, but he could see that she was emotionally exhausted from the ordeal. Let's go home, he said gently. I think we've had enough excitement for one evening. Celeste nodded, but as they prepared to leave, she paused and looked around the restaurant one final time. The faces watching them were no longer filled with curiosity or judgment, but with respect and admiration. She had found her voice tonight, had stood up for herself and her marriage in a way that commanded genuine respect. Actually, she said, surprising Adrian, I'd like to finish our dinner first. Adrian raised an eyebrow. Are you sure? After everything that's happened? I'm sure, Celeste said, settling back into her chair with a confidence that seemed to radiate from her very core. Patricia Hartwell tried to drive me out of here because she thought I didn't belong. I'm not going to let her succeed, even partially. We came here to have dinner together, and that's exactly what we're going to do. Adrian's smile was brilliant as he took his seat across from her. Have I mentioned lately that I'm completely crazy about you? Not in the last 10 minutes. Celeste replied with a grin that felt more genuine than any expression she'd worn in months. As they resumed their interrupted meal, the restaurant gradually returned to its normal rhythm. Conversations resumed, though many diners continued to cast admiring glances in their direction. The story of what had happened tonight would spread through Beverly Hills society like wildfire, but for once, Celeste found that she didn't care about the gossip. She had chosen love over fear, partnership over perfection, and authenticity over acceptance. And in making that choice, she had discovered that the woman she truly was, the woman Adrian had fallen in love with, was more than strong enough to handle whatever challenges their future might bring. What did you think of Celeste's journey tonight? Have you ever had to choose between fitting in and being true to yourself? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments, and if this story inspired you, please share it with someone who needs to hear about the power of choosing love over fear. 3 months later, Patricia Hartwell would be sentenced to community service and anger management classes. Her husband's business would indeed fail, forcing them to sell their Beverly Hills mansion and dramatically downsize their lifestyle. But that night at Spago, none of that mattered to Celeste and Adrian Williams. What mattered was that they had faced their greatest test together and emerged stronger than ever, ready to build a future based on love, respect, and the unshakable knowledge that they truly belong together. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as interesting as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.